person after person I've talked to who said they actually feel mentally and physically better than they ever have in their life. They ignored the doctor's advice, who say it's pseudoscience, actually learned, read books, listen to podcasts of self-discovery. I hope everyone can be pushed more on that bottoms up discovery, because it would transform the country.
Are you going through life blind? This is Eyes Wide Open with Nick Thompson. On this podcast, we share knowledge and stories that build human connection while elevating stigmatized societal issues such as mental health, holistic wellness, culture, free speech, and more, all to ensure we show up in the world with our eyes wide open. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Eyes Wide Open. We have an amazing guest today. But before we get to that, I'm going to ask you, as I do every week, please like, share, and subscribe. I appreciate your support. If this episode means something to you, I appreciate you sharing it. And if it means something, or you think it might mean something to someone else, please share it with them. So our guest today is Calley Means. Calley is a former consultant in the food and pharma industries turned activist and advocate against them, including their poisoning of our food system and the corrupt nature at which our regulating agencies enable this to happen. I've been following Calley for at least a year now, if not a little bit longer, after seeing him on Breaking Points and even maybe before that, the Jimmy Dore show, where he was, advocating against the unhealthy practices and narratives in the food and pharma industry, which is something that I've been doing, in my friend group and among people in my life for almost a decade now, which, as those of you who know me from Love is Blind, I make my own toothpaste. I make a lot of my own products because I understand how many chemicals and how all of this stuff is produced and farmed in a way that is not necessarily for our benefit and could actually be detrimental to our overall health and wellness, from the way our bodies feel to the way that we look to the way that we feel from a mental health perspective. All of these things are fed to us from the foods that we eat. So having Calley on today was a real good get for me on this show. He's someone that I've been hoping to have on for a while, and I finally worked up the courage to shoot him over a DM and ask him if he wanted to come on. He is also the founder of a company called TrueMed, which is an organization that issues food and health promoting services as prescriptions that allow you to utilize your HSA funds within your healthcare program. And as we come up to the end of the year, that's something that is very beneficial. So I encourage you all to check out his work on TrueMed. And today we're going to talk about his journey from a young kid in DC wanting to be in politics all the way up through his time consulting in food and pharma to now advocating against it. So this is a great episode. I'm going to be super curious to hear what everyone says. And let's get to that episode with Calley Means. And hopefully when you finish this episode, you can look at the world and look at the food and the industries in front of us with your eyes wide open. Our guest today is Calley Means. Calley is an activist, and he advocates against food and the pharmaceutical industries for their horrible narratives, unhealthy practices. He's also the founder of TrueMed, which is an organization issuing prescription food and exercise, enabling your tax dollars to be spent on health-promoting products and services. Who would have thought we needed that? He's also co-authoring a book with his sister, Dr. Calley Means, which will be focused on utilizing food as medicine. And before whistleblowing and advocating against pharma and the food industries, Calley was a consultant for those companies. So we're going to get into all of that. But Calley, thanks for coming on today. How are you?
Pumped to be here, Nick. Yeah, doing good.
Yeah. Me too. This is going to be a fun one. This is something. So the food and pharma industry for me, like I discovered its chaos like 10 years ago, and I found mine. And a lot of people know this because I was on a reality show and I talked about making my own toothpaste on the show. So that was my journey. My journey started like, what the hell's in our toothpaste? And then here we are now. So before we get started and into the work you're doing and the advocating you're doing for truth and transparency in our food industry, I always ask my guests, what did you want to be when you were growing up? How did that change to where you ended up and what you do now with your work?
I grew up in Washington, D.C., like in the district. Most people, Maryland and Virginia. I was born right in Georgetown. My dad moved to D.C. in the 70s to work in politics before I was born. My neighbors were CIA agents, like interesting people around the dinner table. And I, from the earliest age, had dreamed of being in politics, being an advisor, and I, as a young kid, I would say I was pretty idealistic, and raised.
We all
Yeah,
are. That's
well,
what's so great about this
every
question.
kid, yeah, it's actually a very good point. I think it really gets to a spiritual crisis we have, which I tie a lot to food and pharma, where that awe and curiosity is beaten out of kids through our education systems. But no, I think I had the right motivations and was raised in a I'd say center right household. I consider myself a Republican, and I really saw industry, as the military, the health industry, just amazing, unimpeachable parts of America. I was, in seminars in college defending the pharma industry and defending the food industry for bringing innovation around the world. I really saw that as part of my identity. I was definitely like the annoying political, idealistic guy in my college classes.
So you were really just kind of like growing up in this industry as it was. And then how did you end up sort of consulting with pharmaceutical companies and the food industry?
Yeah, I think this is an important kind of lesson I learned, which is everyone, I would say, gets into politics and policy, for the right reasons, I think. And then the force of money is really pronounced. I mean, pharma specifically spends 5 times more than the oil industry. We often hear about the oil industry being this vilified industry spending so much money. They spend 5 times more on lobbying and public affairs work. Pharma is the largest lobbying spender, the largest donator of money to politicians, the largest funder of research, and the largest spender on TV news ads in the country. So, this is the behemoth. Healthcare is the behemoth in DC. And inevitably, you're sucked into that vortex. I was recently there, actually meeting with members of Congress on this issue I'm now passionate about. But there last week with a number of my good friends who are now lobbyists. On both sides of the aisle, people that worked for Obama and people that worked for McCain, who I worked for right after college, and it's just fait accompli. It's just what it is. You have people from both sides of the aisle inevitably helping pharma, and then food is right behind it as one of the top spenders, big food. So I was working for the interest group, advocating for pharmaceuticals at that time. In 2010, 2011, opioids were a big thing. So actually, as a junior person, working to steer money and research grants to pain doctors, and we were trying to triangulate pain doctors who might be have some insight and input on regulation. So shuttling them research and consulting payments. And then I've talked a lot about, on the food. The next meeting is with food companies, and SNAP food stamps was a big thing, and was helping Coca-Cola really make sure that you can't even make it up, but $10 billion per year go from the SNAP program, which is for lower income folks for nutrition, to soda companies. So the government treasury, $10 billion straight from there to soda companies every single year.
Jeez.
And I helped um, pay off, frankly, a lot of groups to keep that policy intact, which obviously just makes no sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense, but I can see like when you're in it, you kind of just sort of get absorbed by it. And I think we see that with our politicians, right? I think, like you said, I think people do have the best of intentions. Why would you go into public service where you're, idealistically not going to get rich, which we know that happens, but you're going in there with the right intentions, but then you just kind of get sucked up. I think I see it happen with politicians I support. So in the
Absolutely.
lobby industry, yeah, it's got to be brutal.
A lot of people go into the motivations, and I've been calling out a lot of these, practices that sound evil, and I think that's a really important point. I didn't really put all the pieces together, even at the time. Literally, like paying off civil rights groups to support coke poisoning kids, basically, right? Or on the opioids, which clearly, in retrospect, just is crazy. It's hard to explain how normalized these things are, and how I think few people in the rooms really consciously understood that they were part of machinery that's really doing damage to the country. Again, going back to kind of my conservative upbringing, I was defending American industry. I convinced myself that actually allowing food stamps to continue going towards soda was somehow protecting choice. These groups and the invisible hand, I think, uses arguments and co-ops arguments from both sides to convince people that peeping isn't isn't wrong. So that was definitely the case. I mean, what I'm talking about is definitely with the benefit of hindsight and a lot of dot connecting and reflection. But yeah, being back in DC, I'm reminded this. It's almost like everyone has plausible deniability because um, everyone in the system is too small to really impact it. With healthcare, my passion in life right now is every institution of healthcare wants us to be sick. They make money when we're sick, but the beauty of that systemic design is nobody's responsible for asking why we're getting so sick or taking responsibility for that. Everyone can play a role without really feeling culpability for the fact that we're all getting sicker and more depressed.
That's so true. And, I talk a lot about health and mental health on this show too. And I think, like, for me, like my journey was figuring out, okay, because I grew up center right, probably too, I would say, in the suburbs, like working class family. And I believed white bread was healthy. I believed that it was okay to eat macaroni and cheese and spaghetti for dinner. And there were no, and I was a little bit overweight as a kid, and my entire family is. So, like, I live that too. But when you get that sort of that wake up call, almost, you can't really unsee it. And I think that's the issue, that so many people don't even want to see it. But then when they do, you can't unsee it. I know, how did this happen? And I've heard you talk about this before, and I think it's your area of expertise to tell. But at some point in like the 80s and 90s, we ended up with this food pyramid that told us complex carbohydrates and sugar were the way of the future, and that we should eat less meat and vegetables. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so I think you really have to understand the handoff between food, which is making us sick, and then a healthcare industry, which is now the largest and fastest growing industry in the country because it profits off us being sick. So this is what I was so interesting to me looking back on literally having one meeting with the food industry, one meeting with the pharma industry. So the post World War II like thrust of food policy what has been towards ultra processed food. So like 100 years ago, we were eating largely fresh food and we had very few chronic conditions. The issues that were killing us were acute conditions like infections or complicated childbirth, things like that, which medicine has been amazing at. But we didn't have many chronic issues, and we were eating whole food. Post World War II, there was a big thrust. The Marshall Plan, feeding the world, shelf stable. So that led to a big, potentially for the right reasons of processed food that could be shelf stable. But the industry then co-opted that and realized that you could, put a lot of addictive ingredients, put a lot of sugar, put a lot of like basically weaponized food if we're making it in a lab. And now today, close to 70% of our diet is ultra processed food. And ultra processed food contains ingredients that we just aren't biologically evolutionarily made to eat. There's seed oils, which are industrial byproducts. There's, we're eating 100 times more sugar than we did 100 years ago. It's unprecedented, the, processed sugar. And then highly processed grains, I would even say potentially is the worst. That's a new invention of the past 100 years where you take the fiber off. That's how these items can stay on the shelf for years. But that fiber blunts the glucose impact and is where a lot of the nutrition is. You kind of have to ask a question: if a food isn't rotting on years on the shelf, what's going on there? What's happening? So you've got chemically laden processed ingredients, artificial ingredients. That's the bulk of our diet. And then, the food industry has become obviously, it's one of the largest industries in the country. And I just think it's important to point out as the cigarette industry declined in the 1980s, as there was more and more backlash to cigarettes. In the 1980s, Philip Morris was the fifth largest company in the world. The cigarette industry really declined. All of the scientists went to food companies. So there's thousands and thousands of scientists. All the cigarette scientists went to food companies, and there's been this trend. And again, in the interest of the food companies, it makes sense. The food has become cheaper and it's become more addictive by design. Okay, kind of makes sense. Not great. It's destroying our health, but that makes maybe sense from the food industry's standpoint. The problem is, and the devil's bargain is, that you would expect the healthcare industry, as every rate of every chronic disease is going up, as cancer, diabetes, heart disease, kidney disease, autoimmune conditions, allergies, literally everything's going up all at once because of food, because we're basically poisoning ourselves. That's not even really in dispute if you really push. But there's no alarm bell being rung. The dean of Harvard Medical School isn't on the halls of Congress saying we need to cut sugar for kids. The Dr. Fauci, who oversaw chronic and autoimmune conditions for 40 years. That was his main purview. And they went from 8% to 65% of the American people had a chronic disease under his 40 years purview, as he funded trillions of dollars to study drugs to manage those, not cure them. Like there's a whole ecosystem here where people profited. People are profiting from people getting sick and actually actively, not only not calling it out. When I was working for food companies, we funded medical groups. The Coca-Cola has funded Diabetes Association to the American Academy of Pediatrics. So it's not only silence, it's actually like in a way direct collusion where these industries that are actually creating the diabetes, creating the kidney disease, creating the liver disease are actually funding, the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association. So that's where the devil's bargain comes in. We need moral clarity, I think, from the medical system to call out the root cause of why we're getting sick, but that would be economically disruptive. Every hospital in this country needs more diabetic folks. They need more obese patients. They need more people with heart disease in order to fill their beds. The pharma companies make money off, these pills you don't stop taking. You just take the statin, the metformin, the SSRI. You get on this cascading chronic disease treadmill and you take these pills for life. So this would be very disruptive to the business model. I think unpacking that incentive that we're getting poisoned by our food and that the largest industry in the country wants that to happen economically, not even getting into any motivations. It's just an economic fact. That's a big issue we need to grapple with.
How do we ever tackle that? Because I mean, that is so well said too. And, I think about how aggravated I was when Bayer was able to buy Monsanto a few years ago and how like that just, went through the FCC, nobody cared. And it was like, well, now they own your food all the way to the moment you die and they can make money on you in this predictive revenue model the entire time. So like when we turn to our doctors and we turn to our healthcare professionals for the knowledge that we as, individual patients don't have, and they're giving you basically propaganda that they're learning in medical school, that they're learning from pharmaceutical reps, that they're learning from the industry. Like, what do we do? Like, where do we start?
Yeah, well, one framework I have is you should stop trusting your doctor when it comes to preventing chronic conditions. And I mean that I think we should trust our doctor when it comes to acute issues, as I said, an infection, a complicated pregnancy, a gun wound, a burst appendix. The system's a miracle. And I think if anyone listening just thinks of a medical miracle, I think you're usually thinking about some innovation before 1960 for an acute issue like antibiotics. Right now, 95% of medical spending is on chronic disease management, not curing, management. So it's like, again, this chronic disease treadmill. 33% of kids right now are pre-diabetic. So you look at that, it's a perfect thing for the medical system because you're inevitably going to be on like a metformin or something for your blood sugar, which is diabetes. Inevitably that kid is probably going to be obese at some point. They're trying to shove Ozempic on them. They're more likely to be depressed if they're pre-diabetic. So they're going to be on an SSRIs, which are being shoved down kids' throats, unfortunately, right now. High school seniors are on Adderall because it's tied to attention deficit. So you're getting on a treadmill there, which is very profitable. So I would just say, given this just factual, what's happening, just empirically looking at this, why would we ever trust this system that has an almost complete failure when it comes to chronic conditions? The more SSRIs are prescribed, the more depression is going up. The more metformin is prescribed, the more diabetes is going up. Like it's not working. So what's going to happen? I think a revolution, which is happening to a large degree. People listening to your podcast, people listening to frankly the most popular podcast in the country, the most popular books in the country, biowearables, which everyone's read. People are working to subvert this system that's clearly lying to us. And I would just say that on chronic conditions, you're not going to die. Like if you don't take first time the doctor recommends it to you, I would urge you, look into what's happening inside your body to make them want to give you that drug, to make them want to give you the metformin. They're not going to explain to you. The last thing I'll say, Nick, and my work now, I'm hearing a lot of these stories, person after person I've talked to who said they actually feel mentally and physically better than they ever have in their life. They ignored the doctor's advice, who say it's pseudoscience, actually read books, listen to, podcasts of self-discovery. I hope everyone can be pushed more on that bottoms up discovery, because it would transform the country.
I agree completely. And I mentioned earlier, like my journey started when I realized there were some chemicals in our toothpaste that didn't really need to be there. And, you get in that rabbit hole and you just learn over time. Like, I can't believe it. And I get asked if I do have one of those medical, emergencies, or I need an antibiotic, I'll do like an immediate care. And they're like, who's your primary care physician? I'm like, I don't have one, because I don't have a doctor that has been able to holistically help me with, any chronic issues that I have. It is always like pushing a drug, or occasionally you'll get out, well, drink more water or drink less coffee or whatever that is. And, I've sometimes I get white coat syndrome too, because I obviously don't trust them. So I'll have like high blood pressure every single time I go to the doctor. And it's like, I'm pretty healthy. Like, I eat really well, or at least what I think. And, it's just crazy because people are doing their own research, but at the same time, like, they do trust their doctors in a sense. And that's why I think it's so difficult to sort of have those, awakenings, but really look at the system and say, hey, this isn't working. It's actually counterproductive to what I'm trying to do.
100%. And yeah, agree totally.
If someone was looking at this, and I have plenty of friends who are diabetic, I have friends who I actually have a friend who has Crohn's disease and several autoimmune systems. Are these things reversible in your view? Is there a way to, like, slowly but surely reverse some of these things?
The doctor isn't allowed to tell you. The standard of care, what their scripts is that obesity isn't reversible, that diabetes isn't reversible, blood sugar levels are completely is under your control to a large degree. Obesity, which of course there's now a push to make that a thing to manage for life, is obviously under our control. Now it's hard to do, and obviously 80 people being overweight or obese is to me an example, not that the American people are systematically, frankly, lazy, and so it's hard. But saying that they aren't reversible, right, is the predicate of getting on, the statin, metformin, the inhibitor for high blood pressure. I've talked a lot about my mom, who was 71, got a pancreatic cancer diagnosis and died abruptly in 12 days. She was on 6 medications before this. She was on the, high percentage are on metformin, the high blood pressure. She was on all of these things. I dealt with her weight too. Every single one of those prescriptions was, oh, it's fine, take the prescription. It wasn't have curiosity for what this represents inside your body. It's chronic conditions can absolutely be reversed. And they can be reversed with simple habits. I mean, this is so simple. It's getting to whole food. It's moving regularly, managing your chronic stress. If simple habits. The last thing I'll say, Nick, and this whole food is medicine idea. I always thought that sounded, kind of light, fluffy. But you can get your blood sugar under control. You can get your cholesterol under control, which is, the cornerstone, they say, of these things. Obesity, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, the thing with obesity too is now with Ozempic, which you mentioned earlier, it's like we're now saying, hey, here's a cure, and guess what? It's medicine. It's always medicine. It's never guiding people the way that they need to go. Like, what do you think about that? Because I see I follow a lot of holistic doctors, a lot of holistic influencers, or whatever you want to call them. But I also follow, standard doctors, more traditional, I guess, in a sense, because I do want to have awareness of what's going on. And I didn't know about Ozempic until a few months back. And I just think about this and I see like doctors pushing it. And it's like, why are we pushing this instead of go on a walk in the morning and go on the walk in the evening, and don't be sedentary, to your point? Like, what do you think about Ozempic? And I do think there's something to it too, that if it can help someone who's chronically obese get on the right direction, but are they going to just be on these medicines the rest of their life, and that's our solution?
I think we've got to be really clear about Ozempic. Why Ozempic is so important is because it's being pushed very aggressively to be the standard of care for anyone who's overweight, starting at 12 years old, and it's now being studied on 6-year-olds. So this is not a joke. They're aggressively to have any overweight or obese over 12 in America be prescribed Ozempic. There's actually a warning on the label that you gain the weight back and have long problems. just stay on it. So that's the problem. It's the stock is sky high. It passed LVMH. Louis Vuitton is the most valuable company in Europe. They're making 90% of their profit in the United States. This is not the standard of care for obesity in Europe. This company, Roe, online pill mill, is advertising carpet bombing subway stations in New York, targeting this to millennials who are thin, saying, "Oh, you need Ozempic." So that's what the fight is over, and I think most people will agree. The root cause of the obesity is just one branch of the underlying health epidemic in this country. You have leading doctors who are pushing this. By the way, because it's a lifetime drug that requires in regularly, and it's recurring revenue for the system. Folks are saying that this is a social justice imperative to have Ozempic subsidized by the government. They're saying it's systemic racism to not have the government pay for Ozempic because so many lower income and people of communities of color have higher obesity rates. They don't have higher obesity rates because they don't have access. They have higher obesity rates because our food system is totally corrupt. Again, that's not the problem in and of itself. It's a symptom of the large, which is that anyone with obesity inevitably has other comorbidities that are part of that. Is visible metabolic dysfunction. It's literally our cells showing us that they have too much energy and don't know what to do with it. So that's the cause of all this. This fact that the medical system, hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes and consulting payments by the maker of Ozempic, who goes on 60 Minutes, which is the top news program in the country, and their number one advertiser is Pharma, including the maker of Ozempic, saying that obesity is genetic. So that it all explains this dynamic we're talking about. They want to get us on a treadmill. We're dependent. This is life or death for these industries. This is a lot of money at stake.
How can they literally look at a child who's probably not outside like we were? I don't know how old you are. I'm 38, but we were, I was outside all the time. Like I was always running around. And like I said, my family, we fall into sort of this audience, I would say, of people who don't really know what's healthy, don't really prioritize exercise and whole foods and stuff like that. So I guess where I struggle to think is, if we're going to be training kids now at 6, which I did not know that about Ozempic being trialed on 6-year-olds now, I knew about the 12-year-olds. How can we reform some form of education? Because teaching people that medicine is the cure for everything, it's a societal issue. And how do we, what do you think we do with schools? Because I think kids, you are a product of what you grow up in, right? And it's the same thing with the genetics comment. Like you grow up thinking bad foods are healthy foods, then you get into you're basically into the ecosystem at that point. So we have to do something, I think, with like education, and not sponsored education like it can be in med school.
Yeah. I mean, med school have lost. Med school is an arm of the pharmaceutical industry. More than 50% of med school funding somehow touches pharma. And the framework I have is, I think we need to think of food as an addiction crisis. I attended undergrad at Stanford, and they have this place in Lake Tahoe where alums can go for a week and hang out in the mountains with other alums. A smart group of people, and it's a family retreat, and they have daycare. They were giving them to 1 and 2-year-olds, like this candy, and I'm like, I know it's kind of like an out of body. I'm like, this is happening at Stanford. It's
this
just
is the
like
smartest people in the world. Yeah,
just like they're like kids without even thinking about it. Like I didn't see anyone else even asking a question or blinking eye. And the behavior issues, if you deny kids, or if you deny a meth head meth, they're going to act crazy. That's what happens. So it's actually a way to placate kids that everyone has bought into, because there's such a universal addiction crisis, and it actually makes it a little bit easier for teachers. It's like a quick thing you can give to the kid to keep them kind of behaving. So I think it's actually as simple as that. But you really do have to piece this together. How have we been blinded? Working for the food companies, we would lobby heavily the FTC the Federal Trade Commission to allow ads on the Disney Channel, things like that, for processed food. Pharma is the number one ad spender for mainstream news stations, which buys off the news. The number one advertiser for children's stations is food companies. So if you watch Nickelodeon these days, it's just wall to wall advertisements for poison and sugar. I think there's something criminal, and I think it's the really issue in the world, in the country. They're serving kids crap. They're sitting kids in desks, as we talked about at the beginning. They're kind of beating the awe out of these kids, who grow up playing and very curious, but then we sit them at desks in sunless rooms, very sedentary, feeding them ultra processed crap. It's not clearly working very well. When you get to high school, 40% of graduating seniors have a mental health disorder. So, and the obvious disease we're seeing with kids, 25% of teens having disease, and I mentioned the 33% pre-diabetes. So clearly something bad is happening to their metabolic health that we're kind of, frankly, have a moral blind spot on with how we are educating kids.
Gosh, that's so well said. It's also interesting. I was thinking about this a few minutes ago when you were talking, but when we're sitting, in school or seeing these ads or anything, and we're being told things like Lucky Charms are healthier than a steak, or your breakfast should be cereal or a donut or muffins, and there's literally no nutritional value in any of that. I mean, maybe the blueberry in the muffin, maybe, but it's probably added sugar, So it is just, we're trained from the moment that we're supposed to do these certain things for these certain meals and eat at these certain times. And it isn't necessarily, tied to any actual research on what our bodies need.
Again, you mentioned the Lucky Charms study. The NIH and food companies jointly funded a study that said Lucky Charms is healthier than beef. The purpose of that research, why back early in my career we funded that, and what I'm seeing now meeting with members of Congress, is it's funny, but it's actually, there's a point. The point is to get these absurd things, NIH stamp on it, and then you go to school boards and you say, well, you can't disagree with the NIH. And then it's like, okay, well, schools don't need whole food. They just can have ultra processed food. Literally, there's research questioning vegetables. There's been a war on meat, telling us ultra processed crap loaded with sugar, highly processed grains, and seed oils is healthy. I mean, that's the point of nutrition research, and it's working. So, yeah, that also helps us prop up, I think, this moral blindness we have in schools. I mean, these corrupt studies produce this corrupt guidance, and then the money and the consulting payments and the recent buy off doctors. So 95% of the doctors that were on the nutrition committee were paid for by food or pharma companies. Then they say for 2-year-olds, we just need to have the government stop recommending poison. I think that would filter down into some policies at schools. And I frankly think it can happen sooner than we think. I mean, very distressing signs with the Ozempic, with what's happening to kids right now. And we're literally going to go bankrupt from healthcare costs. What's happening with kids is not normal, with the mental health and frankly just overall health kids. We're going to have a non-competitive population, and it actually mathematically we have to change the current trajectory, and we're not going to drug our way out of the problem. We're going to have to stop poisoning these kids.
That's so important. I wonder that too. I'm thinking to myself sometimes, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in in the world, but really in this country. And if you follow the money, you usually find the culprit pretty quickly. But what I worry about is long term, if we have an overweight, unhealthy, mentally sick, physically sick population, how do we compete? Where do we compete? And how do we, stay as the society that we are, love it or hate it? But how do we do that? Why is no one thinking about that from a political perspective?
Oh, it's the top political societal issue we have. And I think what's nerve-wracking about this day and age is that in a way, our system's working, there has been advancements in health. It's been co-opted on chronic. This issue is existential. We will cease to be competitive as a society continues. If 33% of kids and growing are pre-diabetic. Pre-diabetes means your cells are malfunctioning. It means you're almost certainly going to have many other issues. It means you're almost certainly going to be depressed. It means you're going to have a shorter, more tortured, less productive life. We're doing that to our kids at scale. Our system also is designed to talk about it. I mean, this isn't happening as much in China, where the leading podcasts and casts are basically chastising the health system and government. I'm able to go and advocate, in DC. So the way the gears are turning. But I think it's like, I don't know. I'm kind of thinking about like nuclear power, like this force that we can summon for good. It could also blow us all up. Like, I think we could get to the right place on health, but if we don't do it quickly, we could blow up. Like, I really do think the top reason is going to be that we went bankrupt while we got sicker, fatter, more depressed, and more infertile.
It's a
the
hole
more
you
we
can't
spend,
just climb out of.
yeah, no, and I think, although there's a lot of distressing things we're talking about, like the fact that we talk about it, the fact that we can point it out is in and of itself, I think, actually a privileged, like optimistic thing. It's like there's a lot of moms listening right now, I'm sure, who are like really thinking about their kids and are like taking matters in their own hands with their kids' health. I know that's happening all over the country. There's people taking their own health into their hands, buying more bio wearables, reading books, listening to these podcasts. So we've got to become firm and grow that bottoms up revolution. And I think things can happen quickly. I mean, things happened very quickly during COVID. I think the healthcare system kind of co-opted that to push what they wanted. But I think, and mental health, I think, is a big one. And we haven't even got it. I know, you talk that, but the relation between what we're doing to our bodies, our metabolic health, and what's happening in our brains is obviously very pronounced. I think, it's got to change. It's unsustainable.
I completely agree. And on the mental health, what are your thoughts? Obviously, we know you put bad food in your body, you're going to feel bad. I ate horrible foods yesterday. I sat on the couch and watched football all day, ate horrible foods. I feel it today. That's usually not my vibe. So it's like, I'm not as clear as I want to be. I'm definitely feeling bloated and all of that stuff. But, the mental health element of it, it really takes its toll on you. And then as someone who has struggled with depression, I've had it under control for a while now, thankfully, without, medication. But how, what role does it play in your mental clarity and your mental wellness?
I think the research is becoming clear on this. I mean, I'm a fan of therapy, but there's increasing research where one group who experiences depressive symptoms does therapy and SSRIs, and one group doesn't do that and does exercise, a food diet. And that second group, with no therapy, no medication, outperforms the first group time and time again in controlled studies. So simple in a way that if you take any animal and put them in a cage without sunlight, sedentary, and kind of force feeding them ultra processed crap, they would not exhibit good mental symptoms. That is actually what we're doing to kids at scale. We take kids who are born to play, to have awe for the world, and we put them at a desk very quickly, very sedentary, force feeding them crap, both physical and mental symptoms, and start drugging them. And actually say it's anti-science to ask whether the ultra processed glyphosate laden crap that we're feeding them could potentially be part of it. I was speaking from Harvard recently, and I mentioned the pronounced link we're seeing between the microbiome and mental health. Actually, it's wild research, but 95% of our serotonin, which our contentment, is produced in the gut, not the brain. Our hormones control everything, and our gut is really our second brain. They're calling it now. A doctor at Harvard said this was pseudoscience. It's just not even. It's not even taken seriously.
And then they use that to discredit people that speak against it too. That's across multiple industries, but I find it particularly relevant in the health industry, where it's nope, that's not real science. It's pseudoscience. You're a witch doctor, et cetera, et cetera.
It is just so sad that we are incentivizing. Again, it's the key things. Food. 70% of our diet's ultra processed food. We have thousands of neurotoxins that are in our food that are not legal in any other country. Particularly glyphosate, which is now being banned all over the rest of the world, really serious impacts on our microbiome and other things. Okay, we've got that. We're so sedentary right now, movement. We're so sedentary that only 20% of 21-year-olds are eligible to join the military. The military is now going to lower standards, physical fitness standards for joining the military because we have such a sedentary population. Sleep. We're actually getting 2 hours less sleep than we did 70 years ago in America. And there's a lot of things you can point to there, but that's an interesting dynamic. And then chronic stress. We're constantly now running from a tiger, right? We're constantly elevated, keeping us addicted, keeping us in fear. Those are the most powerful forces to make money. And that there's trillions of dollars of incentives basically preying on our metabolic health. And it's really suboptimal and sad that we have these identifiable dynamics that are, you know, ensuring Americans aren't really on their best, and then ignoring that and lunging to a very marginal pharmaceutical solution, frankly, I would say. I'm not just demonstrably anti-drug or anti-antidepressants, and everyone should be on their own. Those could be pills in some ways could be part of it. I'm not just reflexively anti-pill, but it's clearly a little out of whack that 25% of women in the United States are on an antidepressant. And I think that's an under-discussed societal dynamic that the pharma industry is kind of getting away with, quite frankly, and how we're really showing a lack of moral courage and moral leadership from the medical system, asking what's the root cause of this pronounced mental health problem.
Yeah, no, that's so well said. I can't disagree with any of that. But you have started TrueMed, right? So I'd love for you to share a little bit about how you're actually kind of helping people utilize their own tax dollars into getting healthy food in their bodies and exercise.
The doctor, I think, needs to be recommending the best intervention. Another study that's being replicated and again and again is that supplementation. Omega threes, which are very are as effective. So there's these what I would call more root cause interventions. Exercising, in the case of depression, or you go to obesity, heart disease, diabetes, the conditions that are plaguing American life right now. It's not pharma or no pharma. It's literally like, let's follow the science for the chronic conditions that are leading to 90% of American deaths and 90% of costs. Doctors should be prescribing food, exercise, core supplements, other metabolically healthy habits as the first line of defense. That's just the best intervention, but they don't. So TrueMed, we very efficiently online, and if appropriate, recommending metabolically healthy products, food, supplements, exercise. And if you have a note from a doctor explaining how the item can help reverse or prevent a condition that you care about and that impacts you, most Americans right now are choosing whether to contribute for next year. The FSA accounts expire at the end of the end. Heard of these accounts, right? And they're kind of anxiety. What can I spend on? If you have a note for real medicine, which is food, exercise, supplements, saunas, cold plunges, etc., they count. So we're partnering with brands like CrossFit. We're partnering with brands like Anvis. We're partnering with leading supplement brands in the payment flow, issuing that telehealth work to make it seamless for you to use tax-free funds on that. So TrueMed.com, you can see the brands we're partnered with and instruction and seamlessly use your HSA, FSA funds towards healthy items. That's what we think policy needs to get to.
I love that mission. I could not agree more. And I'll just say, too, one of the big things for me managing my depression without medication, because I was on medication for a while in my 20s, it was morning walks. It was evening walks. It was getting a dog so that I'm held to doing those. And I'm not saying that cured all of it, but it just definitely kicked like my days off on a better note where I wasn't just rolling out of bed and into a desk. I also have a standing desk here. So I don't know if you could tell, I stand most of the day just so that there's those micro movements. But yeah, so I want to thank you. But before we do that, and we'll put all those links in show description too. I'm going to give you a chance to ask me anything before we finish up here. Anything your heart desires. I'm an open book.
Well, I was curious, what do you think of the new psychedelic research, like psychedelics in general, to as a wider cure that should be encouraged for mental health?
Wow, that is such a good question because I've been thinking about that a lot lately, specifically with like seeing all the ketamine shops. I'm in Chicago, so all the ketamine shops popping up. I think I so I grew up, weed's a gateway drug, all drugs are bad, all of this stuff, right? So to me, I have to overcome that. This is bad. But I think the research is showing that this is actually really helping people that have probably more chronic issues than I would have, or a lot of the people in my life would have. And it's helping them overcome severe anxiety, severe depression, traumatic events from their past that influence how they interact in their world today. And I think anything like that, especially in a controlled environment where we're letting the science guide us, I think it's completely a game changer for people. If you can really help people do these, like a ketamine treatment or do some sort of psychedelic treatment, why not? Like if it's going to take care of these chronic issues that people are having mentally, why not? What are your thoughts? I'm curious how you feel about it too.
Well, I grew up in the exact same way as you. I've gotten to the point where I think we grouping illicit drugs, drugs that are illegal right now, into one box is playing plans of pharma. Basically, meth, Adderall is okay and a serious treatment, and benzos are okay, and frankly, opioids, some of the most dangerous drugs because pharma has decided that those are good drugs for them, are like fine. It's like anyone can take those. It's totally not frowned upon. But psychedelics, which actually in the 1950s and 60s were considered one of the most promising treatments ever studied, groundbreaking research at top universities, and actually very purposely stigmatized and outlawed, with Nixon kind of worried people were too thinking for themselves about the Vietnam War, not drafting. Actually pushed that ban. Partly one of the reasons they did, and this is documented. Michael Pollan and others have talked about this, is because they were worried it was more of a one-time treatment. 71, I think it was just a flat ban in the U.S. made every other country ban these substances who did research partnerships with the U.S., which is basically everybody. So they basically just went off the face of the earth. But yeah, so I think we're a little bit falling into the trap. There's this chart of the most dangerous and deadliest drugs. Well, top is sugar, and then it's a bunch of legal drugs, benzos and opioids and Adderall, which is basically one molecule away from crystal meth. And the lowest is MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, and they're the ones that are stigmatized. So the graph is basically backwards. Um, so yeah, so that's just like kind of how I've gotten over the stigmatization. Then the science, I think. So my core philosophy is let's get to the root cause. The root cause of a lot of our mental and physical is I think that we're being poisoned. We're sedentary. We're away from the sun, away from movement, away from natural food. I think psychedelics plays a part in that because I think it falls under the root cause framework because it is not a numbing agent. It's a way to increase neuroplasticity. And study after study saying at least 70% of people in the study say it's one of the five most meaningful experiences of their life, and that opinion stays for over a year. And then yeah, my personal experience is it was very unexpected. I had an experience with it after my mom died, and it was the most impactful experience of my life doing an intentional kind of medical, I would say, psilocybin experience was the most formative experience of my life. So, and I don't know too many people who've done a uh, kind of what I'd call, yeah, the controlled, serious kind of medical route, who would disagree with that. So if that's true, then if it really is that type of impact, it can help people really re-examine trauma that's holding them back. I think it's a very societally impactful modality.
You kill the reoccurring revenue model of
Yeah,
pharma. That's yeah.
it's dealing with our brains, which is the highest leverage point, and this push towards um, approval is going to be it's much different than marijuana. It's like disruptive fight actually that pharma I is actually going to fight. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I think they're going to fight it too. I'm surprised because I'll see like chains of like innovative care places, and they're actually opening up like psychedelic work. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, oh, is like pharma getting on board? Is the medical community getting on board with this? Because if you see corporate getting involved, it's kind of like a different tide turning.
Yeah, it is, and I think we got to keep a close eye on that. There's also, it's tough because there's like this state by state deregulation, and then they're actually going for FDA approval. I actually think that we should the state by state tapestry quality equal what weed has done. I don't think is the model. A lot of people in the community are really skeptical of the FDA approval because they hate the FDA and think it's corrupt, which I think it is. But I think personally that's the route I support because I think if it's FDA approved and kind of just universally federally just like legal where like anything you can get a prescription pretty easily, um, then I think that normalizes it and credentials it in a pretty powerful way where it's okay for grandma to do now. I think it's important. So there's a big debate about this because I think other people understandably are very skeptical and just like let it bloom, let it be free. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting on this, I think, and I think it's going to be more and more of a story in the mental health world.
Yeah, I think so too. And I have a few friends that have done various types of treatment. And of course, you hear like famous people talk about it too. And no one has anything but positive feedback, similar to what you said when you did your experience after your mom. It's like life changing for people. So I'm curious. I'm also very aware that the FDA is corrupt and that we got to be keeping an eye on these things because same with weed, right? Like they're already trying to patent GMO versions of hemp plant, and it's just like, here we go. So we gotta keep an eye on these people. But yeah, thank you. Thanks again for coming on today. And I know I said this before we recorded, but your work, like this is something that I've been banging my head against the wall for 10 years, talking about our food and our regulators and everything just slowly killing us and poisoning us, and we're not even given the information. So when I heard you a year or so ago for the first time, I was like, oh my God, someone's finally speaking out. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for what you do in general and all the work you're doing in Washington and with TrueMed. I think it's going to help a lot of people and move us in the right direction. So where can people find you on your social?
CalleyMeans on the socials, Twitter and Instagram, TrueMed.com. We can save on your real medicine.
That's a great time to do it too, because you're going to lose that money if you don't use it in the next 6 weeks.
That's right.
Right.
Thank you, Nick.
All right. Well, yeah. Thanks for coming on today. I appreciate it. Thank you for joining us on this week's episode of Eyes Wide Open. If you enjoy the show, the best way to support us is by sharing or dropping a review. For more information and content, check out engagewithnick.com or find me on Instagram at nthompson513. Don't go through life blind. Do the work so you can show up in the world with your eyes wide open.